The air in the land office was thick with the smell of stale paper and smug satisfaction. Corinne stood before the counter, her hands clasped tight around the worn leather of her reticule, feeling the gaze of every man in the room. They were not kind gazes. They were the sort of looks that measured a woman by what she had lost, and Corinne had lost nearly everything. The deed to the old Redmond place. The clerk, a man named Barrows with a slicked-down parting and eyes that missed nothing, announced to the room. His voice was louder than it needed to be. 160 acres in the Silent Valley, sold for the outstanding tax of $2 silver. A low chuckle ran through the assembled men. It was the sound of crows picking over something left for dead. Corinne felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck, but she forced her spine to remain straight. She had come west to escape pity, not to wallow in it. Barrows slid the folded paper across the scarred wood of the counter. It stopped just short of her outstretched fingers, a deliberate, petty gesture. "All yours, missus, though what a woman alone means to do with a valley no one's run cattle in for 30 years, I can't imagine." "Perhaps I don't intend to run cattle," Corinne said, her voice quiet but clear. She let her gaze sweep over the smirking faces, landing back on Barrows. "Perhaps I just intend to live." She placed her last $2 silver on the counter. The coins, worn smooth with the passage of 1,000 other hands, seemed small and inadequate. Barrows picked them up one by one, inspecting them as if she were trying to pass counterfeit hope. Finally, he grunted and swept them into a drawer. With the deed in her hand, Corinne walked out of the office. The laughter didn't follow her, but she could feel its echo against her back. The town of Redemption was small, and its judgments were large. They had seen a widow, grieving and alone, spend the last of her husband's savings on a piece of land everyone knew was cursed by time and tragedy. The Redmond place. A name that was a ghost story in itself. The journey to the valley took the rest of the day. The buckboard she'd hired from the livery left her and her meager trunk at the valley mouth, the driver refusing to go further. "Bad luck in there," he'd muttered, not meeting her eye. "Been quiet for 30 years. Best to let it stay that way." She watched him go, the dust of his departure settling around her like a shroud. Then she turned and faced her inheritance, the Silent Valley. It was well named. The wind whispered through the tall, dry grass, but there were no birds singing, no coyotes calling. The silence was a physical weight, pressing in on her. The Redmond place had been a prosperous ranch once, but a fever had swept through, taking the family. Then a feud with the neighboring ranch, the Sullivans, had ended in fire and bloodshed. The Sullivans had packed up and vanished. The Redmond cattle were sold off, or scattered. For 30 years, the valley had been left to its ghosts. Corinne picked up the handle of her trunk with one hand and her satchel with the other and began to walk. The track was barely there, 2 ruts being slowly reclaimed by sage and thistle. She walked for nearly an hour before the homestead came into view. Ruin was too gentle a word. The main house had a sagging spine of a roof. The barn stood open to the elements, its great doors long since torn from their hinges. Fences lay in splintered heaps. Barrows and the men in town had not been wrong. She had bought a wreck. She had traded her last coins for a monument to failure. Tears pricked at her eyes, hot and sharp, but she refused to let them fall. Crying wouldn't mend the roof or fetch water. She dropped her trunk on the porch, the sound startlingly loud in the profound quiet. She pushed open the front door of the cabin. It hung on one leather hinge. Inside, dust lay thick as a blanket on every surface. A pack rat's nest sat in the cold hearth. It was worse than she had imagined. It was hopeless. She sank onto the porch steps, the splintered wood biting into her palms. The sun was beginning to dip below the western rim of the valley, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Despair, cold and heavy, settled over her. The men in town were right. What was she doing here? She was a fool, a woman who had traded grief for destitution. She had nothing left. She was utterly and completely alone, and then she heard it. At first it was so faint she thought she'd imagined it, a trick of the wind in the eaves. A thin, metallic sound, a tiny rhythmic clinking. Tink, tink, tink. She lifted her head, straining her ears. The sound was gone. She shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. Of course it was gone. It was a phantom, like the hope she'd carried with her all the way from Illinois. She was hearing things. The silence was so deep, it was creating its own echoes in her mind. She stood up, brushing the dust from her skirts. She had to find a place to sleep that wasn't open to the sky. The smaller outbuilding, perhaps a spring house, looked more intact. She would start there, one step at a time. That was how you survived. You didn't look at the whole mountain of sorrow. You just looked at the next stone you had to move. She was halfway across the yard when the sound came again, clearer this time, carried on a sudden gust of wind that funneled down the canyon. Tink, tink, a link. Tink. It was a bell. A small one. A cowbell. Corinne froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. A cowbell. But that was impossible. Barrows had said it himself. The driver had said it. No one had run cattle in this valley for 30 years. The fences were down. The water troughs were bone dry. The grass was tall and ungrazed. It made no sense. She stood motionless for a long moment, the last of the sun's light fading around her. The sound was coming from the upper reaches of the valley, from the tangled canyons and rocky slopes that rose up behind the ruined homestead. It was a place you would have to be a fool to go into as night fell. A place where a person could get lost, twist an ankle, or worse. The sound came again, a little more insistent now. Tink, tink, tink. It sounded lonely. It sounded lost. It sounded like the only other living thing in this entire godforsaken valley. Corinne looked back at the gaping door of the ruined house. She looked at her trunk sitting forlornly on the porch. She had come here to be alone, to grieve in a place where no one knew her name. But the silence she had craved was proving to be a terrible companion. That tiny, impossible sound was a question. It was a sign of life in a place of death. Leaving would be the sensible thing to do. Barricade herself in the spring house, wait for morning, and then decide what to do with the wreck of her life. But sensibility had fled her when she'd laid her $2 on Barrows's counter. She was already a fool in the eyes of the world. What was one more foolish act? She turned away from the ruin of her new home and started walking toward the sound of the bell. She didn't know what she was doing or what she would find. She only knew that she couldn't bear the silence anymore. She had to know what was making that sound. She had to know she wasn't the only living soul in the silent valley. The light failed quickly. The valley floor, which had seemed so empty, now revealed a treacherous landscape of hidden rocks and gopher holes. Corinne stumbled more than once, her thin-soled shoes no match for the terrain. The air grew cold, raising goosebumps on her arms. The bell was her only guide, a fragile thread of sound she clung to as she pushed deeper into the growing dark. It led her upward, away from the flat meadow and into the mouth of a narrow canyon. The walls rose steeply on either side, blotting out the last of the sky. Here, the silence was even more profound, broken only by the scuff of her own boots on the rocky ground and the maddeningly intermittent chime of the bell. It would go silent for long stretches, and in those moments, a terrible doubt would seize her. Had she imagined it all? Was she chasing a ghost? Then, just as she was about to turn back, the sound would return. A little closer, a little clearer, pulling her onward. Tink-a-link. She came around a sharp bend in the canyon and stopped. Ahead of her, a natural barrier of fallen rock and ancient twisted junipers blocked the way. It looked impassable. The feud, She remembered the driver saying, "Fire and bloodshed." Perhaps this rockfall was a part of that story, a deliberate act of sealing something in or out. The bell was on the other side. She could hear it clearly now, a steady, patient rhythm. Corinne searched the rockfall for a way through. It was a solid wall of granite and dead wood. But near the canyon wall, a narrow gap, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, offered a sliver of passage. It was dark and forbidding. She hesitated, her hand resting on the cold stone. This felt like a threshold, a warning. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs, and pushed herself into the gap. The rock scraped against her clothes, catching and tearing. For a moment she was wedged tight, a wave of panic rising in her throat. She closed her eyes, forced herself to exhale, and wriggled forward. She emerged on the other side into a hidden pocket of the valley, a small circular meadow sheltered by the high canyon walls. And there they were. In the pale moonlight that filtered down into the clearing, she saw them. Not one, but a small herd, perhaps a dozen animals, their coats a deep uniform red that looked almost black in the gloom. They were not like the cattle she remembered from Illinois. They were smaller, shaggier, with wide-set horns that curved gracefully upward. They looked ancient, wild. One of them, a cow with a sway back and a gentle face, wore the bell. It hung from a cracked leather collar around her neck. As Corinne watched, the cow lifted her head, and the bell gave a soft tink. She was the source, the mystery. The herd watched her, their large, dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. They were not afraid, merely curious. They stood quietly, chewing their cud, as if a strange woman appearing from a crack in the rocks was a perfectly normal occurrence. A calf, tucked close to its mother's side, let out a soft bleat. Corinne felt a laugh bubble up in her chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. They were real. She was not mad. 30 years. For 30 years, this small, lost herd had survived here, hidden from the world. How? The fences were down, but the rockfall had created a natural corral. There was water. A small spring bubbled from the rocks at the far end of the meadow, and the grass here was thick and green. They had been protected, cared for. She took a tentative step forward. The cow with the bell watched her, but did not move. Corinne held out her hand, speaking softly, the way she used to speak to the nervous foals on her father's farm. "Hello there. So you're the one making all the noise." She was so focused on the animals, on the impossible reality of them, that she didn't hear him until he was right behind her. "You're a long way from home." The voice was a low rumble, laced with rust. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, and it sent a jolt of pure terror through her. Corinne whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. A man stood in the shadow of the canyon wall, not 10 feet from her. He was tall and broad, a silhouette against the moonlit rock. He held a rifle in the crook of his arm, its barrel glinting. He was as still and solid as the granite around him. "Who are you?" she breathed, her voice a thin whisper. He stepped forward, out of the deepest shadow. His face was all angles and planes, shadowed by a low-brimmed hat. He had a dark beard, threaded with gray, and eyes that seemed to hold the same ancient stillness as the valley itself. He looked at her not with menace, but with a deep, weary exhaustion, as if her presence was a burden he had long expected but hoped to avoid. "I could ask you the same," he said, his gaze flicking from her face to the herd and back again. "This is private land." "This is the Redmond place," she corrected, finding a sliver of courage. "And I hold the deed. My name is Corinne." A flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed his face. He stared at her for a long moment. Barrows sold it. It wasn't a question. He finally sold the ghost trap. He did, she confirmed. To me. The man's gaze was unsettling. He seemed to be looking right through her, weighing and measuring her in a way that had nothing to do with her lost fortune or her status as a widow. He was looking at her spirit, and she felt suddenly transparent. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "This part of the valley isn't for you." "The bell led me," she said, gesturing toward the cow. "I heard it from the house." His eyes followed her gesture, and the hard lines of his face seemed to soften just a fraction. He looked at the animals with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was more than ownership. It was something deeper, more protective. "She wanders sometimes," he said. "The bell is so I can find her." "They're yours then?" Corinne asked. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he took another step closer, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. He took in her torn dress, her scuffed shoes, the scratches on her arms from the rock passage. "You're a fool for coming in here at night, and a bigger fool for buying this place." "I've been called a fool before," she said, her chin lifting. "It's starting to lose its sting." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "My name is Sullivan," he said finally, as if the words were being pulled from him. The name hit her like a physical blow. Sullivan. The other family. The feud. The ones who had vanished 30 years ago. He hadn't vanished. He had stayed. He had stayed and kept watch over this hidden, impossible herd. "You're a Sullivan," she said, the pieces clicking into place. The feud, the rockfall, the hidden herd. It was all connected. He wasn't just a recluse. He was a secret keeper. He was the ghost of the Silent Valley. "I am," he said, his voice flat. He shifted the rifle in his arms, not threateningly, but as if reminding them both of its presence. "And these cattle are the last of a line that has been in this valley for 100 years. They are not to be bothered." "I don't mean to bother them," Corinne said gently. "I was just glad to find them. Glad to know I wasn't alone." That seemed to take him by surprise. He looked at her again, a long, searching look. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft sound of the bell and the gentle munching of the cattle. He seemed to be having an internal debate, his brow furrowed. "The calf is lame," he said abruptly, gesturing with his chin toward the small animal that was now favoring its front left leg. "Came down on a rock. I was about to see to it when you arrived." Corinne's gaze immediately went to the calf. She could see it now. The slight but persistent lift of its hoof, the way it leaned against its mother. All thoughts of her own fear, of the strange, grim man standing before her, vanished. There was an animal in need. "I know a little about such things," she said, moving slowly toward the calf. "My father raised horses. A sprain is a sprain." Sullivan watched her, his expression unreadable. He didn't stop her. He didn't help her either. He just stood there, a silent sentinel, as she knelt in the dirt beside the nervous mother cow. "Easy now," Corinne murmured, not looking at the man but at the animals. Her voice was low and steady, a tone she had perfected over years of calming frightened creatures. "Easy, Mama. I'm just going to look." She ran her hands gently over the calf's leg, her fingers probing with an expert touch. The calf flinched but didn't pull away. It was warm and swollen, but she didn't think anything was broken. "It's a bad sprain," she said over her shoulder. "It needs to be wrapped and kept off it for a few days." "I know what it needs," Sullivan said, his voice still gruff. "I don't have the means." Corinne looked up at him. For the first time, she saw not a threat, but a man in a bind. A man who cared for these creatures but was limited by his solitude. "I have muslin in my trunk," she said, "and I can make a poultice, if you can help me get him somewhere quiet." He stared at her for a long, long time. The moon moved from behind a cloud, illuminating his face. She saw the deep lines etched around his eyes, the silver at his temples. He was a man who had been alone for a very long time, a man locked away with his memories and his ghosts. And in that moment, she understood. He was as much a secret as the herd. He was the why. "There's a lean-to behind my cabin," he said at last, his voice so low she barely heard it. "It will have to do." It was an offering, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. And Corinne, without a second thought, accepted. "All right then," she said, getting to her feet and brushing the dirt from her knees. "Let's get to work." The journey to Sullivan's cabin was a silent one. He moved with a quiet efficiency, fashioning a sling for the calf, and lifting it with a strength that belied his weary posture. Corinne followed, the mother cow trailing anxiously behind them, the bell a frantic, worried jangle. Sullivan's cabin was tucked into a fold of the canyon, almost invisible until you were upon it. It was small and stark, built of rough-hewn logs, but it was not a ruin. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a sign of life that was both comforting and startling. The firewood stacked against the wall was neat and plentiful. The windows were clean. This was a place of order, of habit, of a life lived in quiet persistence. He led her not to the main cabin, but to a small, sturdy lean-to built against it. It was clean, with fresh hay spread on the floor. He gently lowered the calf onto the bed of straw. The mother cow pushed in behind them, nudging her offspring with a low moo. "I'll get the muslin," Corinne said, "and my bag. There are herbs in there that might help." He gave a curt nod, his attention already on the calf, his large, rough hand stroking its flank with surprising gentleness. Corinne made her way back through the rockfall and across the moonlit valley to her own ruined homestead. The contrast was stark. Her place was a testament to decay and abandonment. His was a fortress of solitude, weathered but unbroken. She felt a strange sense of trespass, not just on his land, but on the fragile ecosystem of his life. She found her trunk, her fingers fumbling with the latch in the dark. She pulled out a roll of clean muslin and the small leather satchel that held her remedies: dried comfrey for mending bone, arnica for bruising, willow bark for pain. They were the tools of a gentler trade, a knowledge passed down from her mother, and they felt like weapons of a sort in this harsh, unforgiving place. When she returned, a lantern was lit in the lean-to, casting a warm, golden glow. Sullivan was kneeling beside the calf, speaking to it in a low, soothing murmur she couldn't quite make out. He had taken off his hat, and she could see his hair was thick and dark, streaked with the same silver as his beard. He looked up as she approached, his face guarded in the lantern light. "You came back," he said, and it sounded like an accusation and a marvel all at once. "I said I would," she replied simply, setting her things down on a clean patch of hay. They worked together in a silence that was no longer hostile. It was a shared, purposeful quiet. Corinne prepared a poultice of comfrey and warm water, the earthy smell filling the small space. She showed him how to hold the calf steady while she wrapped the leg, her hands moving with a deftness and confidence that surprised him. He could feel it in his stillness, in the way his gaze followed her fingers. He was a man unused to help, unused to another presence in his carefully constructed world. She could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he avoided letting their hands touch. But as they worked, a subtle shift occurred. He started anticipating her needs, holding the lantern higher, passing her a strip of muslin before she asked. "He'll need to stay off it," she said, tying the final knot. "The poultice should be changed twice a day, and he needs to be kept warm." "I know how to care for my own," he said, but the words lacked their earlier bite. It was a statement of fact, not a dismissal. She sat back on her heels, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the night was fading, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its wake. The lean-to was warm, filled with the scent of hay and herbs and living creatures. It felt safer than any place she had been in months. "You can't stay here," Sullivan said, as if reading her thoughts. "I know," she said, looking at her own torn and dirty dress. "I have a house, or what's left of one." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the sleeping calf. "The Redmond place is no place for a woman alone." "It's the only place I have," she said, a hint of the day's bitterness creeping back into her voice. He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and serious in the lantern light. "There was a reason this valley was left empty, Mrs. It wasn't just fever. It was bad blood. The Redmonds and the Sullivans. We poisoned this ground for each other. My father made me promise to keep this herd safe, to keep the bloodline pure and hidden, until the hate had burned itself out. 30 years is a long time for a fire to burn," Corinne said softly. "Some fires never go out," he said, his voice grim. "They just bank down to embers, waiting for a wind." He looked at her then, and she felt as though she were that wind. "You being here? It's a complication." "I don't want your cattle, Mr. Sullivan," she said. "I don't want your valley. I just want a place to be." He stood up, his tall frame filling the small space. He picked up his hat from a peg on the wall, turning it over and over in his hands. "The roof on your spring house is sound. There's a good stove in there. I checked it last winter." Corinne stared at him. He had been on her land. He had been inside the one building that was habitable. He hadn't been a stranger watching from the hills. He had been a guardian of a sort, a silent neighbor she never knew she had. He had been tending not just his cattle, but the entire valley, keeping its ghosts company. "You've been watching me," she said, but it wasn't an accusation. "I watch everything that moves in my valley," he corrected her. "It's my habit." He placed the hat on his head, shadowing his eyes once more. "I'll walk you back." The walk back was different. The silence was companionable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. He carried the lantern, its light a small moving island of warmth in the vast dark valley. When they reached the rockfall, he held her arm to steady her as she squeezed through the narrow gap, his touch firm and impersonal, yet it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. He walked her all the way to the porch of her own ruined house. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, the lantern light casting long, dancing shadows. "The spring house is back there," he said, pointing. "The door sticks. You have to lift it." "Thank you," she said. "For the calf," he said, not as a thank you, but as a statement of transaction. "You have good hands." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had offered, and it warmed her more than the lantern light. "I'll come back in the morning to check on him," she said. He gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll be there." And then he turned and walked away, the lantern a receding star in the darkness, leaving her alone once more on her broken-down porch. But she was not the same woman who had sat there in despair just hours before. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of the memory of a cowbell, the presence of a hidden herd, and the unsettling, compelling reality of the man named Sullivan. She had followed a sound and found not just a mystery, but a life. And in the heart of the silent valley, something had begun to stir. The next morning, Corinne woke with the sun. She had slept in the spring house, a small stone building that was cool and clean. As Sullivan had promised, the roof was sound, and a small pot-bellied stove stood in the corner, dusty but intact. After a night spent on a bed of old sacks, her body ached, but her spirit was lighter than it had been in a year. She had a purpose, a patient to tend. She ate a dry biscuit from her stores and then set out, following the path she now knew, back to the hidden meadow. As she approached the rockfall, she saw him. Sullivan was there, waiting for her, a bucket of fresh water in each hand. He had been clearing the passage, moving some of the smaller rocks to make it easier to get through. "He's thirsty work," Sullivan said by way of greeting, nodding toward the meadow. He didn't look at her, busying himself with shifting a particularly stubborn piece of granite. I brought more poultice, she said, holding up her satchel. They walked to the lean-to together. The calf was resting quietly, its mother standing guard. Corinne knelt and unwrapped the leg. The swelling had gone down some. She cleaned the area and applied the fresh poultice, her movements efficient. Sullivan watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. "You do that like you were born to it," he remarked. "My mother was a healer," Corinne said, concentrating on her work. She believed there wasn't a hurt on God's green earth that couldn't be soothed with the right leaf and a little patience. "Patience," he grunted. "Not much of that left in the world." "Maybe you just have to know where to look for it," she replied, glancing up at him. A routine settled between them over the next few days. Each morning, Corinne would make the trek to the hidden meadow. They would tend the calf together, their conversations clipped and practical, revolving around the health of the animal, the state of the weather, the scarcity of certain herbs. But beneath the surface of their sparse words, something else was growing. A fragile trust. She learned about him in fragments. She learned that he was the one who had kept the spring at her place from silting up. She learned that he knew every rock and tree in the valley, that he could read the weather in the clouds and the changing of the seasons in the flight of the birds that he claimed weren't there. He was a man deeply rooted in this place, a part of its very fabric. He, in turn, learned about her. He learned that she was not afraid of hard work, that she had a quiet strength that was more formidable than any loud declaration. He saw the way she moved among the cattle, her calm presence soothing them. He watched her mend a tear in his shirt with neat, small stitches, a task she performed as naturally as breathing. He found himself leaving a bucket of fresh spring water on her porch each morning and a stack of split firewood in the evenings, small, unspoken gestures of care. One afternoon, as she was examining the brand on the mother cow, a simple, elegant S intertwined with an R, she finally asked the question that had been burning in her. "Sullivan and Redmond," she said, tracing the old mark in the air. "You were meant to be partners once, weren't you?" He went very still. He was mending a piece of harness, his big hands surprisingly nimble. He didn't look up. "That was a long time ago. A lifetime ago." "What happened?" She pressed gently. He put down the harness, his hands curling into fists. "Greed happened. A lie happened. My father trusted Jedediah Redmond, trusted him like a brother. They were going to build something here. But Redmond got an offer from a buyer back east, a price for the whole valley that was too good to pass up. He tried to cheat my father out of his share. There was a fight. Things were said that couldn't be unsaid. Things were done that couldn't be undone." He gestured vaguely at the valley. The fire wasn't an accident. The story hung in the air between them, a 30-year-old ghost. "But the fever came first," Corinne said. "The Redmonds were gone before." "The fever took his wife and child," Sullivan said, his voice flat and hard. "It took the heart out of him, made him bitter, made him reckless." He finally looked at her, his eyes blazing with an ancient anger. "He accused my father of bringing the sickness to the valley, cursed our name. That was the lie, the one that started the fire." Now she understood. The feud wasn't just about land or money. It was about grief and blame, and a friendship so deep its shattering had broken the valley itself. Sullivan wasn't just guarding a herd of cattle. He was guarding his family's honor, standing a lonely 30-year vigil against a lie. "I am sorry," she said, and the words felt terribly small. He just shook his head and picked up the harness again, the conversation clearly over. But a door had been opened. The history she had only guessed at was now real, a living pain in the man beside her. The calf was almost healed. It was beginning to put weight on its leg, and soon it would rejoin the herd. Corinne felt a strange pang of sadness at the thought. Her purpose here was coming to an end, Soon there would be no reason for her to come to the hidden meadow, no reason to see Sullivan. It was on one of her last visits that the world intruded. She was laughing, a real, genuine laugh, as the calf butted its head against Sullivan's leg, demanding a scratch behind the ears. Sullivan was smiling, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his grim face, making him look years younger. It was a moment of pure, simple peace, and it was shattered by the arrival of Barrows. He appeared at the rockfall, his town clothes and shiny boots looking absurdly out of place. He was not alone. Two rough-looking men stood behind him, rifles held loosely in their hands. "Well, well, well," Barrows said, his slick smile firmly in place. "What do we have here? I heard rumors, of course. A ghost herd. But to see them in the flesh, and with our grieving widow playing dairymaid, and the ghost himself, Sullivan. I should have known." Sullivan straightened up, his smile vanishing. He stepped in front of Corinne, placing himself between her and the newcomers. "This is private land, Barrows. You're trespassing." "Am I?" Barrows sneered. "I see a herd of unrecorded, unbranded cattle. By county law, that makes them strays. And strays belong to the territory. As the county agent, I'm here to claim them." "They're not unbranded," Corinne said, her voice shaking slightly. "They bear the Sullivan-Redmond brand." Barrows threw his head back and laughed. "The brand of a dead family and a man who's been legally dead for 30 years. That won't hold up. I have the paperwork. These cattle are a public nuisance, a danger. I'm impounding them. For the public good, of course." His eyes gleamed with greed. He wasn't interested in the public good. He was interested in the price the unique bloodline of the herd would fetch. "You can't," Corinne whispered. "I can," Barrows said, his smile widening. He gestured to his men. "Round them up." "No," Sullivan said, his voice a low growl. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The menace in that single word was enough to make Barrows's men hesitate. "Don't be a fool, Sullivan," Barrows warned. "It's 3 against 1. Don't you want to live to haunt this valley for another 30 years? Sullivan didn't move. He stood like a mountain, his fists clenched at his sides. Corin knew he could fight, but she also knew it would be a bloodbath. He would be arrested or killed, and the herd would be lost anyway. His promise to his father would be broken. "Don't do this," she pleaded, putting a hand on Sullivan's arm. The muscle beneath his sleeve was rigid as iron. He looked down at her, and she saw terrible despair in his eyes. The same despair she had felt on her first night in the valley. He was trapped. The past had finally caught up with him. He slowly, reluctantly, stepped aside, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and Barrows's men moved in, their movements clumsy and rough. The cattle, unused to strangers, panicked. They scattered, bellowing in fear. The mother cow, her bell clanging wildly, tried to protect her calf. One of Barrows's men shoved her brutally with the butt of his rifle. A raw, guttural sound of rage came from Sullivan's throat. He started forward, but Corinne grabbed his arm. "No, don't. This isn't the way." He looked at her, his face a mask of fury and grief. "Then what is the way, Corinne? To let them take everything? To let the lies win?" "No," she said, her voice fierce. "The way is to fight them with the truth." She didn't know where the words came from, but she knew they were right. She had found something in this valley, something more than a herd of cattle. She had found a home. She had found a man who had been wronged, and she would not let them be taken from her. The breaking point was swift and brutal. Barrows and his men drove the terrified herd out of the hidden meadow, their rough shouts and the frantic clanging of the bell echoing through the canyons. Sullivan stood and watched them go, a statue of defeated rage. The wall he had allowed Corinne to breach was rebuilt in an instant, thicker and higher than before. "You should have let me handle it," he said, his voice hollow. He wouldn't look at her. "They would have killed you," she said, her own voice trembling. And they still would have taken the herd. They took them anyway, he shot back, turning on her. The pain in his eyes was a physical thing, a wound deeper than any rifle ball could make. 30 years. I kept them safe for 30 years. From winter, from wolves, from sickness. And in one afternoon, because of you? He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air between them. Because of you. The accusation, though unspoken, struck her like a blow. She had been the wind that had fanned the embers. She had brought the outside world into his sanctuary, and it had destroyed him. Go home, Corinne, he said, his voice flat and dead. Go back to your ruin. This doesn't concern you anymore. He turned and walked away, not to his cabin, but deeper into the canyons, a man seeking a solitude so profound no one could ever find him or hurt him again. Corin was left standing alone in the empty meadow, the silence returning with a vengeance. It was no longer a peaceful quiet, but a crushing, absolute void. She stumbled back to her spring house, the tears she had held back for so long finally falling. He was right. It was her fault. She had been foolish, selfish. She had seen his loneliness and mistaken it for an invitation. She had disturbed the ghosts and brought the vultures down upon him. Despair was a cold, familiar companion. She could leave, pack her trunk, walk out of the valley, and never look back. No one would blame her. It was the sensible thing to do. But as she sat on her cold floor, the image of Sullivan's defeated face burned in her mind. And she remembered her mother's words. There isn't a hurt on God's green earth that can't be soothed with the right leaf and a little patience. And the truth. She had told him they would fight with the truth. What truth? The word of a recluse against the paperwork of a county agent? Her gaze fell upon the small pot-bellied stove. Sullivan had said he'd checked it last winter. He had been in here. Why? Just to see? Or was there something else? On a hunch, she went to it. The iron was cold and dusty. She ran her hand around the back, her fingers searching for anything unusual. And then she felt it. A loose plate, just behind the flue. Her heart hammered. With trembling fingers, she worked it free. Inside the cavity was a small tin box wrapped in oilcloth. She lifted it out. It was heavy. She carried it to the light and pried open the lid. Inside was not gold or money. It was something far more valuable. A thick ledger book, its leather cover stamped with the same intertwined S and R as the brand. And letters. Dozens of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. The top one was addressed in a strong, elegant hand to Jedediah Redmond. The postmark was 32 years old. She opened the ledger first. It was a cattle registry. Every birth, every death, every calf of the Sullivan Redmond herd was meticulously recorded, dating back 50 years. It was a testament to a shared dream. But it was the letters that held the real secret. She untied the ribbon and began to read. They were from a lawyer in the East, the one representing the buyer for the valley. And they told a different story. The buyer had indeed made an offer, but he had made it to both men. It was Redmond who had been hesitant, who had written back expressing his love for the valley and his partnership with his friend, Sullivan. It was Redmond who had proposed a counteroffer, to sell the Eastern Syndicate the timber rights, but to keep the valley floor for their families, for their herd. The last letter was a draft in Redmond's own hand to Sullivan's father, outlining the plan, full of excitement for their shared future. It was a letter that had never been sent. The fever had come first. The lie was not Redmond's greed. The lie was the feud itself. A misunderstanding, born of grief and suspicion, that had festered for 30 years. Sullivan had spent his life honoring a promise based on a falsehood. He was guarding his father's anger, not his honor. Corinne knew what she had to do. Barrows had said he was holding a public auction for the cattle in redemption in 2 days. That was her deadline. She found Sullivan at dawn, sitting by the spring in the hidden meadow. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked broken. "I told you to go," he said without looking at her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady. She held out the tin box. "I think you need to see this." He looked at the box, then at her, his eyes full of suspicion. "What is it?" "The truth," she said. "The truth you've been guarding all this time. You just had the wrong story." He read the letters in silence, his face unreadable. He read them once, and then he read them again. When he finally looked up, the anger and the grief were gone, replaced by a profound, soul-shattering sorrow. The foundation of his entire life, the righteous anger that had sustained him through 30 years of solitude, had been a lie. "He didn't betray him," Sullivan whispered. "My father. We were wrong." "You were grieving," Corinne said gently, kneeling beside him. "You were all just grieving." She took his hand. It was cold as stone. "It's not too late to make it right." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "How?" "Barrows is auctioning the herd tomorrow in town," she said. "We're going to be there." The auction was a town event. The square was crowded. Barrows was on a platform, puffed up with his own importance, playing the part of the civic-minded official. The cattle were penned nearby, looking miserable and afraid. Corinne saw the faces from the land office in the crowd, the men who had laughed at her. They were all here to see the end of the story. Barrows was just starting his speech when Corinne and Sullivan walked into the square. A murmur went through the crowd. The ghost of the valley, walking in the daylight, and the fool widow beside him. "Ah, the happy couple," Barrows sneered. "Come to watch the proceedings?" "We've come to stop them," Corinne said, her voice ringing out in the sudden quiet. She was terrified, but she stood tall, the tin box clutched in her hands. "On what grounds?" Barrows demanded. "On the grounds that you are a thief and a liar," Sullivan said. His voice, so long unused, was a powerful baritone that carried to every corner of the square. He was no longer the broken man from the meadow. He was a man with a purpose. He was the last Sullivan of the Silent Valley, and he had come to claim what was his. "These cattle are legally strays," Barrows blustered. "These cattle are the registered Sullivan-Redmond herd," Corinne declared, holding up the ledger. "And this ledger proves it. Every animal here is documented." Barrows paled. "That's an old book. It means nothing." "Then perhaps these letters will mean something," Corinne continued, her voice rising. "Letters proving that Jedediah Redmond never betrayed his partner. Letters proving that the feud that you all whisper about was a lie born of grief. A lie that men like you, Barrows, have profited from for years by keeping this valley empty." She began to read from Redmond's last letter, her voice clear and strong. She read of his love for the valley, his respect for his partner, his dreams for their children. By the time she finished, the square was utterly silent. The story they had all known for 30 years had been rewritten before their very eyes. "These cattle are not just livestock," Sullivan said, stepping forward. His gaze swept over the crowd, and no one laughed now. "They are a promise between two friends, a promise I have spent my life keeping, even though I had the story wrong. They belong in the valley, and so do I." He turned and looked at Corinne. "And so does she." It was a declaration. In front of the entire town, he was choosing her. He was choosing their future over his past. As if on cue, a sound cut through the silence. A single, clear tink. The old mother cow, the one with the bell, had pushed her head through the rails of the pen. She looked straight at Sullivan and let out a low, mournful moo. Without a second's hesitation, Sullivan walked to the pen, unlatched the gate, and led her out. The rest of the herd followed, calm now, clustering around him as if he were the only solid thing in a shifting world. The animal had chosen. The truth was undeniable. Barrows stood on the platform, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. He had been beaten, not with guns or fists, but with the truth. He turned and scurried away, the laughter of the crowd now following him. Corinne stood beside Sullivan, the herd gathered around them. The people of Redemption looked at them differently now. They saw not a ghost and a fool, but a man of honor and a woman of courage. They had not just reclaimed a herd of cattle. They had reclaimed a story. They had reclaimed a future. The valley would no longer be silent. Months passed. The valley bloomed. The grass grew green and lush under the warm sun, and the sound of a cowbell was once again a part of its music. The herd, larger now with the birth of new calves, grazed peacefully on the valley floor. The Redmond place was no longer a ruin. With the help of a few men from town, men who now looked at Sullivan with respect instead of fear, the roof was mended, the fences were rebuilt. The house was filled with the smell of baking bread and fresh-cut pine. It was a home. Corinne stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, and watched the sunrise paint the sky. The door opened behind her, and Sullivan came out, wrapping his arms around her from behind. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his beard tickling her neck. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Morning," she replied, leaning back against him. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the light spread across their valley. "You know," she said after a long moment, "they laughed at me. In the land office. They said I was a fool for buying this place." "Were they wrong?" he asked, a smile in his voice. "No," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "They were right. I was a fool. A fool for a ghost, a fool for a bell, and a fool for a lost herd of cattle." She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines that were no longer so deep, no longer so grim. "It was the smartest foolish thing I ever did." He bent his head and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and forever. In the distance, a bell tinkled, a soft, sweet promise. The valley was no longer silent, it was singing. And as Corinne stood in the arms of the man she loved, surrounded by the life they had built together, she knew that she had not just found a home. She had become one. And she wondered if you had ever heard a sound so small it changed your whole world, what you would do. Would you have followed that bell? She knew she would do it again, 1,000 times over.